Good morning.
Everybody this morning. You make it through retrograde okay? I'm not sure I did. I don't know if everybody out here has a favorite principle, but I do. And I'm going to use that principle as a jumping off point today to talk to you. And my favorite principle is that the doorway to Reformation is never closed against any soul here or hereafter. And I find that just an absolutely beautiful principle. I think it's reassuring, I think it's forgiving, I think it's loving, and sometimes when I'm reading for people it can be very comforting, especially if people come in and they've had a suicide or something in the family and they're with that Christian belief that they're up there getting punished or something, you know. I like to remind them of our principle and what it says. But I've always just felt it was the loveliest principle. It's saying that life is a process, here and hereafter. That there are no deadlines for learning. I mean, why would we have deadlines for learning? But we've been kind of brought up to believe that maybe we do. But there's always hope. There's never a deadline for you to turn things around and make yourself a better person and step up a notch. There's no dead-end street. There's nothing that you can do that could be so bad that you can't make efforts to turn it around. And that's a beautiful thing, to not have to go through life knowing you've made this horrible mistake and there's no turning back. It tells us that the good and the bad are points in a process. And so, with any mistake, we always have time to stop and say, okay, I don't like what happened here, I don't like how I was, and I want to change this. Now I'm going to be talking today about the old religions versus the new religions, and I'll tell you what that means as I go along. But I want to preface this by saying that I'll be referring a lot to the old religions. I'll be referring really to Christianity. And I wanted to say that up front because obviously Christianity is what I know. I'm brought up in a culture that's predominantly Christian. And so there may be religions out there where some of these generalizations I'm going to make absolutely don't apply, and I certainly don't want to be offensive to them. And so I'm going to say that most of what I'm using as examples of old thought would come from our Christian religion that's so prominent here. Now back in the 1800s, Emma Hardinge Britten gave us the principles for spiritualism. And they were revolutionary in their time. And they're still revolutionary, although we've come to, as spiritualists, sort of take them for granted. And the one I just talked about, the doorway to Reformation, is truly a revolutionary principle in the sense of we're looking at things in a totally different way than traditionally we have. It might not be a good news to everybody. It always amazes me that there are people out there that just don't want to work on themselves. They want to kind of slide by and get to death and kind of do what they want to, and then they figure it's over and they're off the hook and everything's okay. And I don't understand that, but there are people like that. And so I suppose a principle like this is not great news to somebody like that if they were really going to believe it. But you know what's funny is when we go to school, you know how we get a lesson and then we get a test, right? And when we're learning a religion, when we're learning the dogma for a religion, we get a lesson and we get a test. Well, in real life, it's not like that. We get a test, and then we get a lesson, right? Isn't that how it really works, you know? How many times have you been going through something, and you're like, I know I'm supposed to learn something. What am I being told here? What am I supposed to get out of here? You know, and you wish somebody would just come along and say, oh, well, what you're supposed to be learning here is this, this, and this. It's not going to happen, right? You're going to have to wait, make your mistakes, hobble along the best you can, until you figure out what it was you were supposed to get from this. And that's the way it is. But out of those mistakes come your wisdom, not somebody else's. Because when we teach the lesson first and the test later, that's somebody else's stuff, isn't it? It's not internalized, that's come from the outside, it's very different. But when we learn that lesson ourselves, it's inside of us, it's part of us. It's something we would believe and don't just follow because we were told to. So I want to start, you know, I'm a political scientist by training, and in political science we try to situate things in their historical context. And religion belongs in the historical context just like everything else. It addresses the needs of the time. So I want to take you back. Now, spiritualism came about in the mid-1800s, but long about that time, what was happening in the world? What was happening in Europe and in the United States? Think about it, that was the Industrial Revolution. A lot was changing. And with those changes came changes in people's thinking. But religion in that time, before the new religions, as I call them, came along, what are the new religions? Well, spiritualism, certainly. Christian Science was a new religion. We had the Quakers. It was a new approach to faith and to honoring spirit, if you will. But up until then, what was religion? What did religion do? Because religion always does something for us, doesn't it? Well, traditionally religion, of course, was there to console people when there was death, when there was disease. But you've got to think back, they had no science to speak of. They would get sick, they didn't understand anything about sanitation, they didn't know what was going on, there were plagues going on, there was disease going on, they didn't know what was going on. They had no explanation. There was the weather. I don't know if we still have any explanation of the weather, actually. We still seem to be pretty confused. But there were things that kind of beset them all the time, and they needed an answer. It didn't even have to be a right answer, but as humans, we always want an answer. We want to understand it somehow. And so they turned to God and to religion. And religion offered them some sort of an explanation. However weak we might think it is now, it was comforting to them. Religion also made the group cohesive. And when you live in difficult times, you need other people. You need that solidarity. And so religion had that effect. Now, there wasn't much religious tolerance, because you couldn't do that. You had to have that cohesiveness. You want everybody believing the same thing and all together on the same page. And religion had that quality of uniting people. And moreover, we go back a ways, there was no separation of church and state, remember? All right, so religion governed. Religion made the laws, basically. Religion told you, this is wrong, this is right. If you do this, this is going to happen to you, whether it's here, whether it's later, it's going to happen to you. So all that was needed, though. It was a bad thing. It was needed at the time, because those were the times. It wasn't about personal growth. It was about behaving yourself so you didn't get in trouble, basically. You didn't want to get punished here or hereafter. So that was what it was about. And once again, when I talked about the learning a few minutes ago, it was from the outside in. All right? So it was somebody else's ideas, and they were definitely fear-based beliefs, you know, which we don't want now, but that's what it was at the time. You were told what you needed to do, what you needed to believe, how you needed to act, and it wasn't about growth, really. It was about staying out of trouble, basically. Staying out of trouble and trying to live the best you could and be as happy as you could. So, and also, people didn't read and write. Most people didn't read and write. And so you had your clergy who were educated. And so the thought was, well, they've got a better connection with God. They know more about these things than we do. So you always had your intermediary between you and God. You couldn't go straight to God. How presumptuous. So, as far as learning anything, your deadline was death. You had a deadline. You had to learn it while you were here, unlike what we say. And there was some sort of a life after death, and that was heaven and hell, but those weren't learning places. Basically, you learned it here, and then depending on how well you did, you went here or you went here. Okay? So, you wanted to get it right. And did it make them better people? I don't think so. I mean, were people better then inherently than they are now because they had those fears or anything? I don't think so, really. But it served the purpose of the time. And that's what religion was, and those were the beliefs. And a mistake, especially if it was a big mistake, it stayed with you. If you made a mistake early in life, that was you. You knew where you were going. Okay? So it's kind of a, it's a rough theory in a way, isn't it? You know, kind of tough on people. So, then we have the new religions, and they came about like in the late 1800s. And so why? What happened? Well, like I said before, the Industrial Revolution happened. Science happened. Now, we think about science now, and, you know, it's usually the scientists who diss what we believe. And so we don't necessarily think of scientists as friends, you know. But actually, science opened up a lot of possibilities for us spiritually, whether we realize it or not. What did science do? Well, science resulted in all kinds of inventions. They gave us leisure. Leisure was a new term. Now, the very rich had leisure, but your rank and file person did not have any leisure. You worked, you came home, you ate as fast as you could. It got dark, you went to sleep, you worked the next day. That was what it was. And so all of a sudden, maybe with the machines and this and that, and I mean, for some people it was a terrible life. It was a very difficult life. But for another group of people, your rising middle class, it was a more comfortable life. Maybe you could send your kids to school and they could learn to read. Maybe you could learn to read. So things were changing. You could go and maybe get some answers yourself. And guess what? You had light. Now all of a sudden you had light. Remember the old stories about Lincoln, you know, reading by the candlelight and how noble that was, and it must have been hard, right? Well, that's what you had to do in those days if it got dark. You didn't turn on a light and say, okay, I'm going to read my book now. You didn't do that. So look at the possibilities it opened. And so we've got a new world. And we're not quite as scared. We've got a few answers we didn't have before. And what happens is faith became more individualized. And we were more free to seek our own answers, which is what spiritualism gives us. Yes, we have our principles, but outside of that, you know, people who are very much into the Native American, they like the Celtic, whatever they like, there's a freedom to seek and find what resonates for us, which is a wonderful freedom, because guess what? It becomes our faith inside of us. You'll live up to something that's yours. You may or may not live up to something that's been given to you by somebody else. So all of a sudden you had greater access. Now you've got separation of church and state. All of a sudden the churches aren't quite as powerful as they used to be. You've got laws. And if you do something wrong, the law is going to come after you, not the priest or the church or something like that. It makes things different. It makes the church a little less powerful and you a little more powerful, because now you're kind of free to search for your own answers. So it was a wonderful birth, and there were scientific explanations to things. It wasn't as scary a time. So you could decide what you wanted to learn. You could decide how you were doing in life and what you thought of it. You know, I always explain to people I read for, when you pass over, it's kind of like, it's not that somebody's there with the whip punishing you for what you've done here. It's kind of like when you were in school and you got your own test back and you had to grade it yourself. It's kind of like that, where we get to look at what we've done and evaluate and decide where we want to take it next. Was that good enough? Do I like the way that came out, or would I like it to be different? So personal growth becomes a big thing. What kind of a person you want to be. Now we have a personal relationship with God, universal intelligence, whatever you want to call it, the spirit world. We don't need that intermediary anymore. We just go straight to God. That's new. That's part of this emerging individual spirituality. And since we know as spiritualists that life is eternal, so is learning. It could just go on and on and on. So if you don't get it one day, maybe you'll get it tomorrow. There's hope. No deadlines anymore. I guess it's nice to run it early, but if you don't, there's still time. There's still hope. And all of a sudden, you know, sometimes when we don't have many answers, we get very defensive about not having answers. And I think that was probably the case in pre-science. We didn't have answers, and so we didn't want to admit there were any answers we didn't have. But as we gain more knowledge, and you'll find this with scientists, you know, they always say the best scientists will be the first to admit that they don't know everything, and that there's things that they just can't answer. It's the mediocre ones who say, oh, I know everything, right? So now all of a sudden, we have enough confidence to say, hey, maybe we don't have all the answers. Maybe we need to look for some of them. Give ourselves permission. You know, Tolkien said, not all those who wander are lost. Sometimes we're wandering because there might be something wonderful out there that we haven't found yet. And now we have the right to do that. All of a sudden, it's okay to make mistakes. That's huge. That's revolutionary. It wasn't okay to make mistakes in the old thinking. You made a mistake, it stayed with you. Now you make a mistake and it's like, whoa, I learned a lot from that. I'm not going to do it that way again. So it's a whole new focus, and mistake takes on this whole different meaning. Now we get to set our own goals. And we can increasingly just decide when we've obtained them and when we haven't. And we can actually allow ourselves to make mistakes. It's okay. It doesn't feel real good sometimes. Some people have more of a hard time admitting it than other people do. But we hear all the time, hey, I'm human. I made a mistake. You know, it's okay. As long as you grow from it. As long as you get something out of it. As long as you learn. So now we understand in the modern times mistakes more as a process and not something that just hangs on us forever and dooms us. You know, if a mistake can't be forgiven, then what's the point of reforming anyway? You might as well just keep doing it, right? That's why I say I don't know if these people were any better for all this fear-inspired behavior that they were subjected to. But the old churches were definitely there to make sure people didn't kill each other, basically. That they treated each other with some semblance of respect, and that the society as a whole would grow and go on. We don't need that from the church anymore. Okay? So the doorway to Reformation is always open to us, and it gives us the possibility of growth and change and fixing whatever we think might be broken. Now, Reformation requires that we recognize mistakes, right? Nothing to reform if there's no mistake made, right? So, by virtue of the road to Reformation always being open, well, we're kind of implying that there are mistakes and you're going to make them. And so, go ahead and see what you can do with them. But I want to give you some thoughts about mistakes, because there's still lots of people around who think mistakes are just the most horrible thing that nobody should do. But mistakes can be very, very good for our growth. Now, to begin with, mistakes only have meaning if they fail, if something you do fails to yield what you thought it would yield. All right, that's when you say it's a mistake. And that kind of falls under the be careful what you pray for category. You know, you think you want something, you think you want it to end this way. If it really did, it might not be so good for you. But if you thought it was going to end one way and it ends another way, at least initially, you're going to think it's a mistake. How many can look back in their lives and remember something that happened where they thought, oh my goodness, you know, I'm sorry that happened. Why did I do that? And then a little time goes by and you look back and you think, darn, it's really good that that happened. You know, it really, thank goodness I didn't get what I wanted, or I thought I wanted. They help us also take personal responsibility. If we can make the mistake and say, I made a mistake. And that's one of our principles too, the personal responsibility. So if we can just admit it, that's a step forward for us. They can be teaching tools. What if you smoked all your life and you got lung cancer? and the doctor's told you there's not a darn thing we can do about you, you can still go out and talk to these young people who think they want to smoke and say, do as I say and not as I did. See what could happen? So you can use those mistakes also for the good of others. You know, the day when mistakes were just this bad thing is over. They're stepping stones. They serve as learning when they're honestly acknowledged. And if we feel okay about mistakes, it's much easier to acknowledge them. They eventually become the pathway to Reformation. No, that didn't work. I'm going to try this now, and let me grow from that. The door to Reformation implies forgiveness. And religion taught forgiveness, but look at the way it treated people sometimes, and there was no forgiveness. We're implying forgiveness. If you do it today, and you're sorry about it tomorrow, and you try to rectify it, it's okay. It's not too late. And forgiveness is huge. How much discussion do we have about forgiving ourselves? Okay? And walking around with guilt. It's such a heavy thing. It's such a damaging thing. Guilt is probably the least productive emotion there is. And it rarely is warranted to the degree that we feel it. So we've got to be able to forgive not just others, but ourselves. And what do they say about forgiving? You don't forgive it for the other person, you forgive it for yourself. So in spiritualism, tomorrow's a new day. And there's always a new day. And if there's always a new day, there's always a new opportunity to grow. And so maybe along that path, we can actually forgive ourselves for what we've done. And we can heal ourselves and move on and become better, more aware people. Find the courage to admit when you've gone wrong. And just say, oh well, didn't get it right that time, gonna try it again. The door to Reformation is never closed against any human soul, here or hereafter. I think it's probably, I'm not going to get emotional about this, but I think it's the greatest statement of love we could possibly make. So I hope in some way that something I've said today touches you and maybe helps you look at something slightly different or heal in some kind of a way. So thank you for listening.